Hello, BookTube. Welcome back to the History Shelf. I am your host, Peg, and today we have a book review. It's the day after Christmas, and I hope all of you had a wonderful Christmas. And thoughts and prayers to all of you still in dealing with all the snow of the major storm that just moved through. We got it off pretty easy here in Denver. But anyway, I thought this book was appropriate for a book review, seeing as how we are still in the Christmas time. I celebrate Christmas all the way through Epiphany on January 6th. We do. So it's still Christmas time. And I finished this book while I was sick earlier this month. I'm still kind of, have ups and down days, but I wanted to share with you the true story of the Christmas truce. Share some of my thoughts on this. The subtitle is British and German Eyewitness Accounts from the First World War. This is written by Anthony Richards, and this is put out by Green Hill Books. This was a delightful little book, perfect for the season, and kind of it's about 200 pages, roughly. Takes a closer look at the truces that kind of erupted at Christmastime, primarily the last week or so of the year of 1914, along in the Flanders fields, the lines between the British line and the German lines. So Anthony Richards kind of swoops in and does a more micro study of that, and it's a great book with a ton of primary source documents. Lots of new letters that he was able to get his hands on from German soldiers primarily. So there's a nice even balance, and there is a plethora of letters, home, newspaper articles that talked about the so-called truce. So it is just, you get a first-person feel for what the soldiers were thinking when the first olive branches of a sort were kind of held up above the trenches between the British and German troops. And I've taken some notes here. I just wanted to talk about some of the things that Anthony Richards brings up in this book. The biggest question that he asks in his introduction is, the question isn't so much why did the truce happen, as opposed to why did fighting resume? Which a lot of people, if you think about it, when you think about this truce, it's always a feel-good story, right? But the hard reality is that these men who may have climbed over top of the trenches, declared a truce, collected bodies for burial, shook hands even, exchanged items, trade goods that they were both missing. Germans would give the British cigarettes. The British might give the Germans some meat or something like that. But as soon as the truce was over, these same men that might have, shook hands or were laughing and toasting each other, killed each other again, which is a very sobering thought. And, on this channel, being the History Shelf, and I have kind of a yen for military history. So I guess in a way, this channel is a little bit of War and Peace, right? We kind of talk about war a lot, talk about living with peace, but at the same time, this Christmas truce kind of embodies that sense. They had a moment of peace during a horrific war. Now, as Anthony Richards says in this book, these truces didn't really reoccur again. They didn't happen after 1914, as the slaughter just hit unimaginable proportions. Obviously, there was no sense of let's enjoy Christmas and be, goodwill toward men and peace on earth. There was none of that. So the Christmas truce, 1914, was an anomaly. But he makes some good points here about why it happened, and then he tries to answer the question at the end, why did the fighting resume? Which we'll get to that. So again, one of the things he mentions in this book is that this was mostly along the front in the Flanders area, where British and German lines, the entrenched lines, were very close to one another. So by December, the mobile war had ended. Excuse me. I'm going to drink a sip of tea here just because I've got a little bit of a hoarse throat. The mobile phase of the war had pretty much ended in stalemate on the Western Front. All those battles, battles of Mons, Ypres, Lacateau, they had ended, and people had pretty much, the British and the Germans and the French that were connected with the British army on the far left flank, they had pretty much started to entrench, and that was it. So in the Flanders area, what made the truce happen as we were nearing the Christmas time was the proximity of the lines to each other. They were very close. So Anthony Richards makes the case that the truce was it made sense in the sense that the lower class soldiery, of course, the superior officers never encouraged this. And in fact, obviously, they wanted to punish people who had been caught fraternizing with the enemy. But the troops on the ground, the grunts, it's like they were both going through the same thing. They were living in horrible conditions, exposed to the elements, lack of food. They were both suffering the same things, and they both knew that of the other. So there was a sense of camaraderie, of empathy. They were all going through it, basically, and of course we have to remember in 1914, even though there were a lot of those ground battles that we talked about, Mons, Ypres, and still the German army was still trying to swing around the left flank of the Allies through Belgium, and just hit a wall at some point because the French general Joffre, I guess I call him Joffre, had finally got his forces together and kind of put a halt to the Germans' advance, and they stalled, and then they entrenched. So there were still possibilities that something might have been negotiated, maybe a negotiated settlement or peace or something to that effect. I mean, at the end of 1914, there wasn't that huge blood hatred, going on. So that fed into the ability of troops to want to just have a moment, of peace, because they were probably still hoping there was a chance that they didn't know at the time that this was going to go on for another, 4 years. So, Anthony Richards says, the proximity played a big role. And then just hearing all of and reading at the front newspapers from home, even the media in Germany and in Britain. And he primarily focuses just on the British and German troops here. He talks a little bit about the France and Belgium, but that was more in the sense of why truces between those sections with the Germans were not really recorded. And it makes sense because, their homeland had been invaded. They weren't about to be friendly. Now, you remember the British were part of the British Expeditionary Force. So they were coming overseas as allies to help. So they weren't defending their own home, which also was a factor in the ability of these troops, these enemies on opposing sides to just call a truce, Excuse me, I'm sorry. I haven't been making videos that much since I've been sick, so my voice is a little hoarse. And then we talk about the media at home. At Christmas time, people are feeling they're very religious back then. Both Christian countries, Germany and Britain, and calls for peace were abounding as they neared, as they moved into Advent, and then the remembrance of the birth of Christ on December 25th. Everyone was calling for peace. So there was that emotional element too. Like everyone just really wanted peace after all that really horrible mobile war fighting that was going on through the summer and early fall of 1914. So I'm going to read some of the entries from the different soldiers just to give you a feel of what was going on there. And of course, Richards calls out the fact that as he's plumbing through all the different archives and the sources, the regimental histories of these groups didn't say that there was a truce. And for obvious reasons, no one wanted to call attention to that fact, and they didn't want anyone to get in trouble. So they kind of left that out. So we have to go off of what the soldiers were saying. And let's see here. It says the first recorded instance of a friendly truce was instigated by the Germans, according to Anthony Richards. And let's see, what do we have here? Okay. Let's see here. It was instigated by the Germans. And yeah, sorry, I'm going to find a good quote here from one of the... Here we go. So this is a soldier. This is says here, among the Germans was a 17-year-old volunteer soldier, Edward Tolk, who was serving with the 55th Infantry Regiment. That's also known as the 6th Westphalian Regiment. He said, tentative, hesitant, we sit here in our trenches. At long last, our trees along the trenches have been lit. He's talking about Christmas trees. The shining trees could be enjoyed all around us, and it truly was a festive sight. All the more so as there was no wind, and the evening appeared blissful with its white frost covering the ground. It was a festive night, and nobody will likely forget it. And then Lieutenant Menke, he was with another group, would have agreed as to the extraordinary circumstances in which the Germans found themselves celebrating Christmas. And Lieutenant Menke says, it was truly a holy night. No shooting could be heard far and wide, not a sound anywhere. The guns rested. The men did not have to go without a Christmas tree either. There must have been one standing in the middle of every single trench. Stars appeared and glittered in the dark sky, when someone must have brought one of the lit trees and placed it on the parapet. Before too long, an entire row of Christmas trees decorated the front line, from one end to the other. Wow. Where previously death and decay were lurking, this simple sign was indicating a German Christmas celebration commanding peace on earth. Apparently, on the following day, English soldiers were heard declaring that the sight of the Christmas trees and hearing the German Christmas carols had overwhelmed them. Despite the glorious Christmas tree lights, a German patrol had been dispatched by the 3rd Battalion and ordered to perform guard duty. But instead of being greeted by the customary bullets, they suddenly heard shouts coming from the English trenches addressing them. So, in many cases, it was the lighting of Christmas trees that brought a visual cue to the other side, in this case the English, that the Germans, their enemies, were feeling peaceful and festive, and there was a like-minded response in many ways. And there's some beautiful passages in here, too, where Richards recalls how music was also another element that led to a more open fraternization. In these early stages, it was mostly them kind of shouting across to each other, those that could speak. Germans, more likely than not, spoke more English than the English spoke German, but they could communicate, and someone would say, hey, Fritz, Merry Christmas or Happy Christmas, and then you'd have the Germans saying, Tommy. They called him Tommy. They would wish them season's greetings and all this kind of stuff. So but they could hear each other sing the carols, which, for some things that the Germans sang were not recognizable, but obviously Silent Night was one that moved everybody, and they recognized, the English recognized the melody and kind of almost sang along with them. So it began with Christmas trees being lit, Christmas carols being heard through the trenches on either side. Let's see here. I'll read this one portion to you. It says here, the lights and singing combined to encourage an exchange of greetings from each trench to the other opposite. And then here's an English soldier's diary entry on this. His name was Graham Williams. He was on sentry duty, and he wrote, when the Germans started singing Still Nacht, Heilig Nacht, I and all the other sentries all woke up the other people to come along and see this. What on earth's going on? Then after that, they finished their carol, so we thought, well, we must retaliate, so we sang the first Noel. And after we finished that, they clapped us, and they started on O Tannenbaum, the most the most miserable sort of dirge-like tune, really. And they sang that, and we went on with other carols, first us and then the Germans. And then we started singing Come All Ye Faithful, and the Germans joined in with that, singing the Latin words Adeste Fideles. Both together singing that, it seemed rather an unusual thing, two sides singing the same carol in the middle of the war. And so it went on. So this book is just filled with moments like that, where even the soldiers are, they're writing about it like, I can't believe this is happening. Just the cognitive dissonance of it, in the midst of wartime. And here we are singing the same carols, wishing each other Merry Christmas in the midst of like death and dead bodies. And it's something that is very striking indeed. And then, let me see here. So then, as the fraternization kind of took on a new level, where they would actually climb over the top, call a truce, like we're not going to fire and shoot, and we're not going to shoot you if you don't shoot us. They would climb over and then make an exchange of goods. That was the other real big appeal of that, was to see what the other side was willing to trade. And again, this was just primarily between the British and the German side, because Richards calls out here in the book too that they shared a common heritage. Germany and France had a very long and bloody history. I don't think there was as much fellow feeling there, even though France was a Christian nation. It was primarily Catholic. So the Germans, again, there was a Protestant type of bond between Germany and Britain. And of course, with Britain, the monarchy, with like Queen Victoria and onward from that, they were all primarily ethnically German. So even the English monarchy, deep German roots. So there was a shared heritage there that seemed to bring them closer together. And I'll just talk about the moment when they do kind of climb on top and of the out of the trenches and meet in no man's land, as it were. So this is one of the English soldiers, Leslie Walkington, who found his interaction with the Germans to be both an exciting and remarkable experience. And he wrote, "We met one another and had a chat halfway between the two lines of trenches and exchanged buttons, cigars, and cigarettes. It was really funny to see the hated antagonists standing in groups laughing and talking and shaking hands. I got a German button and 2 cigars and a cigarette. One or two of them actually came from London and said they hoped to return after the war. Of course, we didn't talk about who was going to win or anything touchy like that. They were 102nd Saxons and were decent chaps, apparently. Several had got Iron Crosses, and we asked one chap what he had done to win it, and he didn't seem to know. They had just heard the Germans had taken Buckingham Palace. Their clothes were not very good, and they seemed a bit jealous of our goatskin coats. They had got half Wellington boots and gray uniforms and wore little round hats without peaks. Of course, none of us carried rifles. It was a beautiful day, and the ground was white with frost. Some of them were trying to arrange a football match, but it didn't come off. Talk about peace and goodwill. I never saw a friendlier sight. We tried to explain to each other that we bore no malice. One of their officers took a photo of a group of intermingled troops. They were not so strong-looking as English fellows, and some were much smaller than even I. I feel much more confident about a bayonet charge now, although I believe they usually run away before our fellows get within 50 yards. So you can see they were even kind of still thinking about the future, fighting ahead. And this entry kind of leads into the next thing, is that when superior officers heard about some of these moments, a lot of the troops were very clever. And they claimed, no, we were intelligence gathering. That's what this was about. And indeed, some of the interactions in no man's land as they came out of the trenches and fraternized, they did take back relatively useful information that they could, send up the pike to the head honchos. But it was also an excuse to cover their butts in many cases, was to say it was strictly reconnaissance gathering. And the Germans knew it too. They used that same excuse, but they also did get some information. Like I'll say here, Anthony Richards says here, just as the British troops were fascinated to see German troops up close, the novelty of meeting with the foe was not lost on the Germans. They recognized, too, that the opportunity was a mutual exercise in intelligence gathering. The need to seek useful information about the enemy entrenched opposite was ingrained into the mind of every frontline soldier, and it is therefore unsurprising that, given their sudden proximity and openness, men of both sides often kept this in mind throughout any meetings. And again, it says here they would use that fact to justify those friendly chats in the first place to their superiors. So just is an abundance of letter and diary entries from both German and British soldiers are just replete throughout this book. And he gives some stats that about 2/3 of the British line, he says, in that area, the Flanders area, had a truce of some sort. Now, it didn't mean that they were always just jumping out of the trenches and having football matches, which, he says they might have kicked a ball around, but that image of them having an organized football match with teams and referees, he says that's probably very unlikely that happened. But the British had about, like 2/3 of the line. They had some sort of truce. Okay, which, again, was not always more than just what he calls, and repeats several times in this book, they called it a live and let live thing. So basically, several days off with no shooting, or artillery bombardments, or things like this. So it wasn't always this picture right here, them getting together. The truce could also have been in several different sectors of the line, just a situation where it was like, look, it's Christmas. Let's just enjoy ourselves as much as we can without any death. Let's not kill each other. Let's not attempt a night attack. Let's not attempt this. Let's give each other opportunities to go and bury our dead. So there was a lot of that. It didn't necessarily mean they were trading, cigarettes and stuff like that. Yes, and I thought the one thing in here that was really new to me was that amongst the Germans, the British differentiated between Saxons and Prussians, and the British preferred to be across from Saxons because they were more open to a shared understanding of just having a moment of goodwill, shaking hands, like we're in a war, we're here to kill each other, but there's nothing personal in it. It's just this is our duty. This is our sworn, this is our duties to kill you. We're taking a small break. And they said that the Saxons, they prefer to be across the lines from Saxons for that reason, but not the Prussians. So this was interesting to me, how he calls out how the Prussians were so militaristic and so by the book. I mean, they did not like Prussians, apparently, the British. And again, he calls out the fact that, France and Belgium were less likely to have any type of truce. There certainly was no handshaking. There might have been a live and let live scenario where they said, look, we're just going to take 24 hours here. Let's not shoot each other. We can bury our dead, do what we have to do. Because it was their homeland. They had been invaded. And of course, there were the stories of the German atrocities in Belgium in 1914 that came into play. It's interesting how he says that the British didn't really talk about that too much. They chose to believe that maybe the men across from them weren't involved in those type of atrocities in Belgium. But anyway, let me see. I'm going to read out to you real quick going to try to end this book review relatively soon. It was a great book. I really highly recommend it if you just want to read about... this was a good book for me to read because it was, again, it's military history, but it was about peace for once. And it was good to read this at Christmas time. Yeah. He says here, the relationship between Germany and France and Belgium, however, was clearly different than that which was, existing between Germany and Britain. For Germany, France, and Belgium, each of these nations' respective roles was clear to all. The Germans were the invaders, while the French and Belgians were fighting to protect their homeland. To meet between the trenches in order to exchange compliments of the season would involve a complete change of mindset for the French and Belgian soldiers. For them, the neutral strip of territory which was designated as no man's land for the British and Germans was, in fact, unequivocally, their home soil. So I think that's critical to remember here. This was reinforced by the fact that French fighting was largely continuing throughout the Christmas period, unlike in Flanders, where the British had effectively ceased campaigning towards the end of December. So, yeah, it wasn't peaceful all along the Western Front, and not at all. There were still battles going on elsewhere. But this was a quiet sector, and this is why this came about. And it was interesting as I was finishing up the book, as he's talking about the legacy of the Truce, and the causes, which we've kind of just talked about, proximity to the Germans, a shared cultural heritage, a sense of not defending their home soil. The Britons, there wasn't that animosity to that level, and also there's so much in this book I could call out, but I've got to end my book review. But there's so much to talk here about. I highly recommend it. But he did mention the fact that afterwards it was looked on with almost embarrassment, especially as Germany, after World War I, was starting to, they went through their 20 years of, Weimar, and then they moved into, obviously, the rise of Hitler. And Hitler, he does make it in a reference to Hitler here, that Hitler tried to poo-poo it like it never did happen. So the more militaristic German leaders later on would tend to downplay it. And I don't think this can be verified. But page 190. Apparently one of Hitler's World War I peers claimed he made the following remark. Heinrich Lugauer. He claimed that Hitler made the remark, "It should be sharply condemned that German and British soldiers join hands in no man's land and sing Christmas carols rather than fire at each other. Such a thing may not happen in times of war." And then he says, Anthony Richards says, accurate and open historical testimony of fraternization during the First World War became increasingly difficult to express in Germany. Such memories conflicted with the popular heroic image of the German soldier, which would form the basis for the nation's official interpretation of that conflict. Under Hitler, the war was no longer portrayed as an unfortunate event which the ordinary German soldier was forced to endure, but rather something desirable and an opportunity for heroism. The Christmas truce did not fit into this narrative at all, other than as an anomaly that might best be forgotten. So, there's a nice image to land on there. So there you have it. The Christmas Truce, the true story of the Christmas Truce by Anthony Richards. Highly enjoyed it. It was great for the season. Still is good for the season, as I'm still, as we approach New Year's and New Year's Eve and all of that good stuff. All I can say is it was a great read, and I hope you guys can check it out. So, with that, let me know what you think. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts, and I highly recommend The True Story of the Christmas Truce by Anthony Richards, put out by Green Hill Books. All right, BookTube. Until next time, thanks for tuning in for this book review, and we'll talk soon.